This next session, I'm excited to hear we have Ron Schwartz with the University of Alaska Anchorage, and he's going to be talking about creating and maintaining employee volunteer responding teams. So without further ado here, I'll send it over to Ron. Thanks, Ron.
For those of you that don't know me yet, I've been working in law enforcement and training and emergency management for a long time. And back when I was a trainer of CPR and first aid in a really rural community, I recognized that the idea of calling 911 is a good one. We can train people what information the call takers are going to need. But it's really important to empower people that are staying there at the scene to know a little bit about what to do to minimize the loss of life and property until those first responders arrive. That's really the basis of the Citizen Corps program called CERT, Community Emergency Response Teams. But it's been my professional crusade for a couple of decades now for people in the workplace to think of themselves as the first responders in the office or at the factory. So that's the basis for this presentation, is the idea that we've used at the University of Alaska here in Anchorage, where I work, to empower the managers to form teams of responders. And it's been done for hundreds of years. You know, in some workplaces in the past, we had fire brigades, we had bucket brigades when coal mining and other mining types of emergencies happen. They couldn't stand around and wait for uniformed responders to come. They had to have a little bit of training and a capability on site to minimize the loss of life. There will be time at the end for questions, and my email address and my phone number will also be included on the last slide if you want to follow up with me in any way. So why have employee volunteers? Well, at the university here in Anchorage, we have our own police department, but most employers are not that fortunate. So we have to think of ourselves as first responders. When somebody collapses, do we know how to check them for responsiveness and provide chest compressions if that's the appropriate thing? We need to really change the way we think of ourselves in the workplace. Plus, you know, if we have employee volunteers, we're already there. We don't have to worry about response time. We could be in the next office or even the next building, and we can still be there quicker than most professional responders. And that makes a difference if we know what to do when we arrive. So we're already there. And then we're already familiar with the building and the resources. You know, do we have a good first aid kit? Do we have a defibrillator in the building? And where is it? Can we send somebody to go get it and bring it to us? That kind of thing. We're also familiar with the hazards on our work sites. Do we have compressed gases and hazardous materials that people need to be aware of after we have an event like an earthquake? So again, we're already familiar with the work site. It makes sense for us to think about having teams of responders in the workplace. Also, when you're part of a volunteer team, it kind of develops a sense of community. We're all in this together. We're making a difference, the sense of ownership, and you get a little more buy-in, employee satisfaction when you're part of the office or the employer situation that you're responding for. And then also, it's a great opportunity to use relevant training and experience that your employees already have. Chances are good that people have come from backgrounds maybe where they were responders or first aid trained in the Boy Scouts, a volunteer organization in the community where they used to live, maybe it was the military. People have some of these skills. Maybe they're a little rusty, but they probably have some idea already of why it's a good idea to know what to do. And then maybe giving them some updated training is all we need to do to make them an effective responder. So when a bad thing happens, imagine a boiler explosion, maybe it's a fire in an office, maybe it's an earthquake. So what is the problem we're trying to address with this concept? Part of the problem is you have potentially overwhelmed professional responders. When we had that 2018 earthquake here in South Central Alaska, We only had a limited number of police and fire and medic responders, and they were going to be overwhelmed going from all the stations that were staffed to all the calls that were requested for service. So who has a problem? It's really all the stakeholders then, right? It's every citizen, it's every uniformed person trying to work together, develop a triage of where to go first. Why should this problem be solved? Well, because minutes save lives. Anybody that's taken a CPR course knows that if someone is in cardiac arrest and nothing is done, the chance of survival after 8 or 9 or 10 minutes is nearly zero. So doing something in the minutes after an emergency starts is imperative. How will I know when the problem's been solved? Well, when the volunteers and professionals are working together. And what we've done in the community campuses at UAA is we've trained volunteer responders within the employee groups, and they are quite often trained by the fire department or the police department in multiple areas of expertise. And then they are offered to come to a monthly training session or come to an exercise or help even design exercises. So they start to get to know each other and they're confident in each other's skills and capabilities. So here's a case study that got me started, at least in the Anchorage job that I'm in. It's almost 14 years ago now. We had a small building, single floor, but it had 4 different entrances, one on each perimeter wall. That had a natural gas leak. We had a serious buildup of natural gas inside. It was an explosive environment. We called the fire department and the natural gas utility. And our job was to evacuate the facility and maintain the perimeter to keep people from going in. Typically, we would ask the university police to do that. And on a given weekday in the middle of the day, we may only have 2 or 3 police officers in uniform. But we had a minimum of 4 exits to maintain and escort the professional responders to the scene. So we thought, how could we do that better in the future? How could we staff a building maybe twice the size to keep people out of harm's way, not only affecting the evacuation, but then keeping people out once that had been accomplished. So the first solution we brainstormed was just hire more cops. But you're talking about an awful lot of money just to hire 1 extra police officer, and we knew that was going to be a limited solution. Number 2 is could we expand the community emergency response team CERT that we already had? And then 3 was could we create some more responders from faculty and staff that work for the university to supplement the police. They didn't have to be police to stand at a door and tell people to stay away, to direct people away and to a reasonable perimeter. If you give them a safety vest, a little bit of training, usually that would be a sufficient amount of authority to get the job done. So those are the 3 solutions that we came up with should this type of event happen again in the future. And we knew it would. So our answer was twofold. We didn't try to hire more cops, but we did create a police auxiliary emergency team. There used to be a pretty robust program across the country called VIPS, Volunteers in Police Service. Quite often they were retired police or they were just community members, sometimes retirees in the community looking to do something useful. So they would do traffic safety surveys, they would answer phones, sometimes they work cold cases in the police station, but they weren't usually responders. So the idea that we had to give them some response gear and some training and to actually respond with the police department was a novel idea. So we went with that. We were kind of inventing it as we go. And we also had a campus CERT. Campus CERT is like the community emergency response teams that you're probably familiar with in your community already. But like a workplace CERT, you get an extra module of training to talk about why higher education campus, especially a residential campus like ours, is different, and what that means. So we also decided to enhance our CERT team on campus, so we had more people responding when the need was there. So under FEMA's Citizen Corps, which kind of started back in the 70s with the Neighborhood Watch program, there's a lot of different partners and programs that they are supporting at Homeland Security. One is CERT, another is VIPS. They took it over from the National Police Chiefs Association. There's also Fire Corps, there's a Medical Reserve Corps, there's a National Neighborhood Watch. So all these programs are supported by FEMA through, supported by Homeland Security through FEMA. And they have really robust basic training that goes with that. CERT is probably one of the better ones, where they have 7 modules of training that can take between 20 and 24 hours to complete. And we don't, although we have a lot of CERT instructors in Alaska, you don't have to be an expert in all of those modules. The idea is to get a professional for a module, perhaps in fire safety, for instance, have somebody from the fire department come in and teach that module. And it has become a really good baseline of training for us that's nationally recognized and vetted. When I'm sharing my screen like this, I cannot see the chat. So if there's anything that I need to know, go ahead and unmute and let me know. So we were going to start this model of police auxiliary responders. We had to figure out who would be on board. Who should we invite? Would they be students, employees, or both? Same thing with enhancing the campus CERT program. So I looked at what was happening around the system already. Our campus in Fairbanks had a pretty robust group of student CERT. And then at our campuses in Homer, Kodiak, Palmer, Soldotna, and Valdez, they didn't have police responders on campus. So we created CERT responders on those campuses using employees. The idea behind using employees, again, we're talking about 20 to 24 hours of basic training plus a pretty regular schedule of retraining and testing. We thought it'd be better to have employees because they're likely to be around long-term, year after year. And then when your people are involved in a volunteer team in a long-term like that, they can become leaders within the team, and ultimately they can become instructors for you. They're also, as employees, they're familiar with the buildings. They may have keys and swipe cards to get access not only to different buildings, but sensitive areas within the buildings to get assets you may need. Using employees also can be the best investment in your equipment and training hours. If I'm training a full-time student and putting him on a team and then retraining him and putting him through some drills, and then he graduates in May, I've lost that asset. It's good for him and good for the community that he goes back to. But again, we're focusing for now on our employees as members of these volunteer responder teams. And then finally, students, they're quite often not on campus all day. They may be on campus for an hour, they go home, or they stay for a couple hours, typically only 4 days a week, an hour at a time. So again, as a responder, they're motivated and excited to be part of a team like this and to get some training. But for us, we found that they probably were not the best use of our time and resources. And typically with CERT, we're giving them a bag of gear that they would respond with. And that's not cheap either. That can be anywhere from $60 to $100 each. And again, to have that walk out the door when a student graduates, we didn't think was the best use of our really limited resources. So how do we recruit? How did I recruit to get people engaged in a volunteer employee team? Well, I had a concepts and objectives meeting. I just kind of cast it out widely to say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this thing. Come hear about it and let me know if you would support it. Not necessarily soliciting for volunteers. We just wanted support for the idea. So what I did is I created paper posters and flyers and put them on bulletin boards. I sent them out to community departments. I captured some email groups that we had within our employee groups and sent out an invitation to the meeting there. I picked a large group, not knowing if we were going to have 5 people show up or 50. Thankfully for us, it was closer to 50. And then we used electronic newsletters and other announcement ideas that just gets the word out that, hey, we're doing something special. And we wanted to give people an opportunity to get in on the ground floor. And to make it inviting, we said, hey, there's only going to be a limited number of seats available. And that worked pretty well for us. So what about you? If you were thinking about getting your employees to volunteer for something extra, and it was responding to emergencies where they might be supporting your security department, or if you don't have a security department, maybe they'd be their own responders. What would be your main method for reaching out to them? So it looks like we launched our poll. I didn't see that pop up on my side, so that's pretty cool. We'll give it another minute to populate here. So mass email is a common feature because pretty much every workstation has a computer, and every computer is using email typically throughout the day. It's just kind of on in the background, right? And then if you have a newsletter, whether it's on paper or electronically, that's a good option too. It's typically targeted to a specific audience, but it may only be launched periodically, maybe once a month or once a week at best. So mass email, you agreed, was a good way to reach people. Imagine that you've got 25 people that said, hey, I'm willing to do more. I'm willing to be part of the solution during a crisis. You have to think about what kind of training do they need. You have to think about the quality of the training, who are your instructors, and also completion. What are your expectations of each member? So if you start with a CERT program, for instance, you know that it's a 20-hour basic training. In our case, we give it each summer. We have to think about attendance obligations. If they only come to half the training, are they now part of your team anyway? Or do they have to wait until they complete the whole minimum obligation? In the case of our volunteers and police service, we just gave them 1 hour initially to say, here's how to direct people and to direct traffic when the police need it. And then we get them together every month. We have a business meeting and we have either a skill drill on what they've already learned. We teach them a new skill, and we bring in guest speakers to kind of keep them motivated. We may have somebody in from search and rescue or canine group or Red Cross or Salvation Army or any number of other organizations that they may encounter during a real world emergency. It keeps them motivated. It keeps them understanding that they are part of the bigger picture in a large scale response. And that has worked pretty well for us. But again, when you're thinking about attendance, what if they only show up for your monthly meeting twice a year? Somebody has to decide how much is sufficient and how little is too little, and go from there. So in our case, with the volunteers in police service, we gave them monthly training that included bleeding control, CPR first aid, search and rescue. We even had somebody from state behavioral health come in and talk about the psychological effects of a disaster or large scale or even a long-term emergency on not only the community, but the team itself. And then we give them some basic training in incident command system. And then we're always offering a training that may be a longer duration, or they could take on their own online to just keep them in the loop and motivated. So in our case, when we had a team that would be representing the police as auxiliaries, the police said, hey, we don't want somebody representing us who's a shoplifter or has a drug abuse problem or something like that. So we do require in that case to conduct a criminal background check on each applicant. And then we have them sign an agreement between the police department and themselves to say, you know, here are our minimum requirements for ethical performance. But most of you aren't going to be talking about auxiliary police. They're just going to be citizen responders reporting either to your HR or to your security department or something like that. So we created a volunteer agreement that says, in our case, it was drafted by emergency management and our human resources officers, vetted by general counsel attorneys. And it's signed by the volunteer, but also the supervisor. So if we're asking them to get up from their desk during a crisis and respond to a street corner to direct traffic, the supervisor is on board with that concept, and they know what it's all about. There's also a release on the bottom that says, I'm an employee, you know, that's my primary responsibility, and I will respond if I can, but there will be times when I just will not be able to. So if I have a team of 20 responders, volunteers, and only 2 or 3 can come support the police response or the security team's evacuation of a wing of a building, that's still a force multiplier for us. This volunteer agreement is renewed annually. And then whenever a new supervisor takes over, again, they need to know that their subordinate is a member of a response team. The reason to have a written agreement is it does protect them under workers' compensation. So if my volunteers, cut their hand moving a piece of debris, or somebody runs over their toe when they're directing traffic, they are still considered a working employee at that point. And that agreement, we think, will make a lot of difference. That's what the agreement looks like. It's pretty short. It's 1 page. And I'll be happy to send anybody in this meeting a copy of that to discuss among your leadership to see if it would make sense for you. So I told you that we started police auxiliary volunteers. We also increased our CERT present. And then we had an earthquake. And I recognized that we had about 40 buildings, multiple floors, and we didn't have anybody going room to room to see if anybody was injured. We assumed that if they were injured, they'd call 911 and we would know about it. But in hindsight, we looked at the damage, like in this men's room in the photo. We looked at the damage in some of our buildings and thought, maybe that was not a wise assumption. We would like to have somebody go room to room and then report to our EOC, or in our case, our dispatch center, to say, my building is clear, no injuries. So what we have done is we've taken 3 of the modules of training from CERT. We're giving them to a new group of volunteers called safety wardens. They're responsible only for the building that they work in. So the idea is to grab a gear bag of first aid equipment for the most part, grab a buddy, and they go room to room. They'll do some light search and rescue if they have to, lifting debris off of victims. And then our Office of Risk Management said, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So they were actually willing to fund not only the training, the student manuals, but also the gear bags that we assigned to the graduates. And again, because CERT training kind of implies that you work in a buddy system, we wanted a minimum of 2 safety wardens in every building on our campus. So we go with light search and rescue training, medical operations 1 and 2, and then we added some tourniquets, trauma wound care, more gloves, and then a headlamp, a good strong LED headlamp if they have to search through a building in which the power has gone out and the lighting is off. So how do they deploy when we have an emergency? Depends on the team. They're each organized differently. With CERT, they know that they have to deploy to a rally point, kind of like community CERT, and then form their own incident commander and decide where to go first. With our police auxiliary, they are an arm of the police department, so they are dispatched by the police department. Years ago, when we had pagers, they carried those. That's no longer a function really supported in the Anchorage area. So we are using email to text. Most email providers will give you an email address for each member that will send them a text automatically. And then, of course, the safety wardens, they work in the building that they're responsible for, so they would self-deploy once they find their buddy. And then the idea is for them to report their findings, or if they need resources, either to our dispatch or to the EOC to get that going. So again, how do you keep the program of a quality nature and make sure the training investment is worth your time? We think it's a good idea to maintain your training records for each person. So you're going to need somebody, kind of a team leader. Maybe it's you, maybe it's the safety manager to get involved. And then if you have minimum expectations for attendance of meetings, for trainings, and some people just don't bother or can't meet those expectations, and you have to be willing to release them from the team or suspend them until they can catch up. Be sure to praise your volunteers in public and then pull them aside and correct them privately if necessary. Our volunteer agreement that you saw says that their performance during an emergency response is not part of their annual evaluation. That may be a component that you do differently in your work site. There's all kinds of times to recognize your volunteers and the work they're doing. Even if they're not responding, they're still taking time out for training and meetings. It's good to recognize them. Each April, we have National Volunteers Recognition Week. It started out with President Bush's 1,000 Points of Light, and we take advantage of that. And then include them. If they're going to be representing your department, your safety officers, your management in general, get them involved in decision making when you're revising your plans, when you're planning an exercise. At least get some representatives from your teams involved. It makes a big difference. And then, like any volunteer group, it can be a challenge to retain them. They're not going to fun events or emergency responses every day, maybe not even every month. So get them involved in other ways. Create leadership positions within the team. If you look at the CERT website through FEMA, there's actually a leadership training module in there that makes sense. Again, you can get them involved with periodic skill drills. If you teach them bleeding control once and then they don't use it for a couple of years, it would make sense to get out some bandaging and splinting materials and just do a drill once in a while. And then remember the whole community approach that FEMA is always pushing, and bring in guest speakers to your group from outside in your community to remind them that we're all working together in the potential responses. Get them involved in full-scale exercises for sure. The photo here is an earthquake exercise we did in the 50th anniversary of the 64 quake. Mostly volunteer responders in our case. And then even the functional and tabletops. Get them involved. Again, they get to promote themselves as a volunteer to the management and all the other employees. And they also have some ideas. So they make a difference in exercise execution. And then engage them in training and recruiting efforts. If you need more members because people have retired, these are the advocates you got already who can go out and solicit for more folks to apply. All right. Those are all the concepts I wanted to cover.
I have one question to start off with here. I was wondering if there's, there's a lot of challenges in kind of maintaining a volunteer base, especially from just kind of the general public. I wonder if you see, is it similar with employee volunteers, or is it a little bit different?
Well, I think I found that it's been easier in employee volunteer groups because we're already kind of part of a team. So if your morale is good within your units, people want to do a little extra. If they see that the security department is professional, they want to be affiliated with them and support them during an earthquake, it would make sense to give them that opportunity. So although it's been a long time since I've tried to recruit volunteers out in the community, at least in the workplace, it's that team mentality that's really worked for us.
Thanks for that. We have a question here from Asha Kamaroff. Does the university have emergency management classes?
We do offer credit classes, yes. There's actually a whole degree program through University of Alaska Fairbanks. And then in Anchorage, we have logistics and all kinds of similar programs that are 3 credit.
All right. And we have a question for your contact info from Sheila. It looks like event support got that contact information up there in the chat box. So Sheila, you can find that there. We have a question here from Amanda Loach. How do you get the supervisors buy-in?
Well, that's a one-on-one conversation. It typically comes from an emergency. So when you have that trash can fire that becomes an office fire, or could have, or maybe you just have somebody collapse and it seems to take forever for that first ambulance to show up, that's a great opportunity to start a conversation with management and say, hey, we've got some quality people here, some already with first aid backgrounds. What do you think of having a response team in-house? So again, doing a team, which will take a little bit of investment, cold can be a challenge, but typically, whether we have an emergency in the workplace or we just see one on the news, those are the times to start these conversations.
So we have a comment here from Asha. She says the small community emergency response plans are good for villages, and we've been pushing up here to update our scripts for our borough villages. And I have kind of a question based off that. How in depth do you get as far as including kind of volunteers into kind of any emergency plans that you have?
They are specifically listed in the emergency plan for the university. I'm in the midst of doing revisions now, and we're now adding this new one, which is the safety wardens, specifically for earthquake response. Yeah. And another one that we're adding is, and I should have mentioned it up front, is there's another important training going on across Alaska using the CERT basic training as a foundation called My PI. It's I'm having a blank right now. But it's an initiative, a readiness initiative for teenagers in our schools to have maybe an hour a week. Maybe it's a weekend, maybe it's a summer camp, where we have instructors come into the schools and teach not only the CERT basic training, but then they do some family emergency planning, some family emergency communication plans, and then they're responsible for doing 6 other families in their community. So it's a real force multiplier that we just started in summer of 2019. The idea is to get teenagers from 13 to 19 involved in readiness as volunteers.
Awesome. I have a comment in response to an earlier question about courses on emergency management. Michelle Torres says she's teaching the principles of emergency management through the fire science degree at UAA. So that might be a good option for anyone looking for kind of continuing education in that. Another question here from Beth Weigel. I'm sorry if I butcher your name there. She says, I work for a museum and we are currently involved in a training by the State Museum to help us draft our disaster plans for cultural heritage organizations. We're trying to put together a volunteer corps to help with moving objects and other cultural heritage items. Do you have any other advice that would help us? So in these scenarios, we're past the response that responds to the danger to life and into the next level of property and culture safety. So any advice for her on kind of next level or volunteers for next level response after the immediate life safety threats?
Yeah, I think the idea that we encountered after the earthquake is to have your response folks think about victims that we're not aware of. Maybe having a search pattern developed in your emergency plans to make sure you not only go room to room, but floor to floor, even into areas like storage and production areas in your facility that are not immediately available or visible from the hallway. Just making sure you're following up and catching everybody who might be victimized by your event. I hope that answers the question. I wasn't totally clear on what the intent was.
Yeah, I think she was asking kind of next, maybe plans for after you're done with immediate life safety, what's kind of the next move there, and any kind of relevant thing for the saving property.
I think when you've done the rescue, you've turned the situation over to professionals, and they've hauled off the victims to hospitals, and the fires are out. The team should get together and do a hot wash or a review of how things went. Should things go differently next time? And then just brainstorm, what that means. Do the plans need to change? Does your training need to change? And take that to leadership to make sure it gets done.
And we have another question here from Amanda Loach. She asks, how did the volunteers' experience and training help in COVID? So did you get to utilize your volunteers during COVID?
Actually, we have not, because we were sending people home almost immediately. We have very few people working on site, and what we're talking about here is workplace response teams. So they were not involved in anything. I mean, we haven't set up any mobile vaccine sites. We haven't done mobile testing on our own. So all our responders have been working from home for the most part this year. We've also suspended the training, MyPI, which is My Preparedness Initiative Alaska. That training has been suspended for the year for the same reason, because most of the school districts have been teaching from home as well until recently.
All right, thanks, Ron. Give a little bit of time for any other questions that come in. I think one thing that really kind of struck me that you were talking about, you said something like, you don't need a police officer to stand at the door to maintain the perimeter. And I think that's a really good point to think about for kind of these volunteer teams, is that, sometimes you just need bodies to do things. It's not always a really complex task. So that might be a good thing to, for folks out there, if they're looking at doing this kind of employee volunteer thing, is let them know that you don't have to be an expert in any one of these types of things. Sometimes we just need a hand here or there with something simple. Yep.
So, really a $10 safety vest on somebody with a little bit of training makes a world of difference. There's a question about MyPI. It's called the My Preparedness Initiative Alaska. We have a website for that, and it's in about 28 different sites in several territories now. Because it makes sense to get our students involved as volunteer responders as early as we can.
We have a comment here from Michelle Torres. She says, if anyone is interested in workplace cert, please reach out to me. I'm the state cert administrator and would be happy to talk to you. So I think this is something, especially at our division, we're going to be looking towards kind of increasing that volunteer base in
Sure.
disasters seems like a really valuable thing to have.
Well, I've been teaching CERT since the massacre at Virginia Tech in '07. That's how long I've been doing emergency management planning. And it was because we didn't have police at our community campuses. We need some sort of responders. And this was the model that made sense for us. But the point I'm making with these two other teams that we created is you don't have to give 24 hours of training to get a certification for your employees. You can do a big piece of your response with only a portion of those modules. It's better than nothing.
And I'd actually like to ask folks out there if anyone has tried doing a volunteer employees before. Maybe if you have, if you can click the reactions button, click a thumbs up or something like that. If you have tried doing employee response volunteers before. Not seeing any thumbs here, so we got one from Charlene Barney. So yeah, I think that might be a great opportunity for folks to look at is kind of employing that in your organization. Is it a question for Ron? Is it a pretty significant amount of work, do you think, or would someone be able to kind of get it off the ground easily?
It really doesn't take a lot of time. The curriculum is already developed. You bring in other subject matter experts to teach the curriculum if you can. To be a program manager for the whole CERT program, if you had that, is all the training all comes free through the Emergency Management Institute. So becoming a CERT instructor, if you wanted to, or managing a CERT program, it's all provided for you through FEMA.
All right, and Beth here has a kind of a clarification to her question earlier about the museums. She says, do you know of any cultural heritage volunteer responder teams in Alaska? Teams that are trained to help rescue, move objects and other cultural heritage collections after a disaster or emergency. So I think she's looking, really specifically at the kind of cultural property response.
We give specific training to those that work on our archives in Anchorage and in Fairbanks, but I'm not aware of any other groups like that.
And Beth, maybe if you could, if you send Ron an email, maybe Ron, I don't know if you can link Beth up with a contact maybe at the university that does the archive preservation.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. All right, thanks, Ron. That was awesome. I really appreciate you talking to us today.